Our fair soul shone with all his might that day. The old star was always his hottest and brightest there in the desert. In the bustling port town of Thriss, my friend in arms, Gunner Faust, and I sat upon poorly refurbished wooden stools in the Wretchen Flagon, and idly listening to an aging orcish bartender telling tales of the oldest building in Thriss to a newcomer at the end of the bar. We had heard the story too many times this month, but for the young newcomer that had stumbled in after a sign's promise of reasonably acquired food and lodgings, it was a brand new story. To be fair, it was also told differently each time. This tavern was called the Wretchen Flagon because the old days when mead flowed so smooth it was akin to a flagon retching up faster than guests could drink it. It was difficult to determine where he would end it, but each telling would eventually close with, "I tried to keep those old days in mind when I fill your drinks." The old orc chugged his glass, and the stranger looked longingly elsewhere for his lost appetite. We sat gracelessly in silence until Faust rose from his stool to leave, and I waved farewell to the orc and his guest. Outside, I found him staring out across the ocean and offered an opinion. "You seem pensive." "I can't stay here another day, Yoni," he said slumpily, kicking up dirt. "Ow. I'm sick of struggling for coins and saying it's surviving." When I first met him, Faust had been a scout for Fark's Keep, journeying out into the great north to brace the expansive, uncharted tundra. I used to hunt for my own food and build my own shelter every day. No one cared how many dirty pieces of metal I had on me. He secured his longbow to his jacket, which he left open to expose the breast of a loose shirt to the seaside air. "We could go to the wildlands by ship," I offered, while turning to see his face. "A few weeks of work, and then we reach the western continent and can do whatever we want." "All we'll find there is a few frontier villages and endless forests. There's nothing worth looking for," Faust reasoned emphatically. That may have been true, albeit rumors at best. The only way to know for certain would be to go there, and that was a great risk when one is poor. Someone cleared their throat and dropped their lanky, limber body from the roof of the flagon into our conversation, and thrust his palms up, preparedly for our simultaneous dagger brandishing, with a non aggressive gesture. "I don't mean to be a bother, but I couldn't help hearing your conversation." He motioned slowly and kept at a peaceful distance. "My name's Richard. I have a job offer for you at Darenthold. They need an escort for the White Lady, and it just so happens they're seeking political nobodies." Faust and I shot each other a confused glance, mounted our skeptical counter argument with the tips of our blades, and were met with Richard's own brandishing of a detailed document. "I found this on a dead noble in the desert." Faust glared at Richard and took the parchment from him, reading aloud. "Escort Countess Vez back to Fark's Keep." Richard scratched his head. "Well, I can't make it to Darenthold on my own. And anyway, the job will be easier with more people. The way I see it, they'll be expecting a few people as it is, and showing up on my own might look suspicious. That does seem too convenient, but work and travel would do us some good," I added, while my friend held up an index finger, calling for a moment of discussion in private. We stood away from Richard, laying our arms across our shoulders to wall off our debate, and Faust began. "How do we know this guy didn't kill that noble himself? Or whether he's even telling the truth?" I assured him of the facts. "We can easily take him if he turns on us, and he can help us get out of the desert. If it turns out to be a lie, we will be in a cooler climate. I'd rather fight him there than here." We stood up, returning to Richard, who waited patiently while picking at some earwax. Faust led the negotiation. "Travel isn't free. We'll help you out if you help pay us for transportation there. We'll split the cost 3 ways." The moment had a good point. These days everything was much more expensive than it had to be. Richard nodded and withdrew a coin purse from his leather jacket. As it turns out, that knight's armor was worth a fair investment into our partnership. Faust shot me a look that would stir the dead, and I laughed lightly to hide my sudden discomfort. We then made Richard strike a deal with the coachman. If you can convince him to take us for this amount, then we'll go take the job with you. 30 silver coins and some small game hunting were promised, but a week in the desert is as good as a month, so by the trip's end, our terribly embittered coachman made certain we knew we would have to pay full 60, and probably interest, next time. Left under the archway to Darenthold, we three planted ourselves firmly at a wall where Faust could sketch a copy of a map which would help us navigate the small, infamously hilly roadways of Darenthold. Approaching the innermost ramparts, we beheld the remarkable brick-on-stone wall known as the Great Gate. A plain, knotty wooden sign proclaimed such in bold, stroked letters, which included a dedication. Free and open, the world's most traveled road. A man accompanied the dedication in a full suit of plate mail, lazily supporting a spear and the red flag of Darenthold. He held out a steel-plated hand and boomed at us as we approached. "What business have you within these walls?" I grumbled an adequate reply. "We're here to respond to a call for an escort to Fark's Keep for Her Highness," and handed him Richard's weather-worn parchment. The metal-clad man lifted his visor to read, then waved his hand toward a nearby stable. "Go wait over there for someone to call you." We reached the stable. When we reached the stable, we beheld an unique sight. Crouching over a chopping block with poised, open palms, and an absolutely ancient man focused his mind. His resolve left us awestruck. We watched through the tenseness in the air. While taking an audibly deep breath, he released a mighty strike into the log, cleaving it in two and launching half of it into a spiral through the air. Richard swung his body out of the way of the flying chunk of wood, and Faust snatched it out of the air with his left hand. It was all I could muster to utter a muttery astounding. "My apologies." From behind his withering beard, he offered a bow, which I knew to be customary of bear worshippers. He wrapped himself in a plain robe and leaned on his cane, saying nothing else during our wait. I was disappointed at not being able to press him for stories. Once inside the castle, now 4 of us met with the icy glare and blinding armor of a decorated officer. Many brilliantly sharp novelties adorned his body: silvery polished greaves, a fabulous mantle emblazoned in red and gold dragon cameos, badges and symbols pinned across the breast and hung from the right shoulder, loops on several fingers featuring sparkling gems. Despite his immaculate uniform, he sat lazily on his throne, supporting his jaw with an arm on the throne's arm. He got right to business, tiredly addressing us as soon as he was sure we were listening. "I am Drillid, King of Darenthold. You 4 will be accompanying the Countess on a 6-month journey north. You'll be expected to protect and care for her, along with 3 men from her personal guard. You should be prepared to fight, kill, and even die for her safety. I've prepared rooms for you in the guest house. You'll be fed and clothed for the mission. You must wear the clothes we provide, and if you don't feel up to the task, then don't show up in the morning." Here he left a very pregnant pause as a sign of his official decree. "Otherwise, enjoy yourselves tonight and get plenty of rest. Consider that an order, gentlemen." He dramatically flipped his mantle while standing to leave, and we were in turn led away. This time the destination was called Citizen's Guest House. The lower floor of the building had a chokingly familiar tavern-like outfit with a bar, plenty of tables, and attentive waitstaff. Faust and I sat at the corner while our bear warrior associate inspected the outside of the building, and Richard went to rest in our room, remarking as he went, "They have real beds in these rooms." The tavern floor became crowded and lively as more locals gathered for their end of week celebrations. The bartender treated us to drinks and thanked us for taking the job. I had many drinks, courtesy of the king. It was right then that I saw them, well drunk with inspiring visions of our future travels. The Dragon Knights commanded the scene, somberly brooding over to their preferred table. One glance upon their ruby flecked equipment, and I dashed off to don a disguise. I emerged from the back of the house strumming a simple tune on my harp, dressed in a costumed robe, the very vision of the elven bards of dragon song, and with the intent of picking up on nightly gossip, I began my debut performance for Tiberius, the Dragon Knight. Oh, wherefore do bones of great beasts lay, scattered and smashed, such lurid dismay? The secret behind this sudden dragon slumber can be found upon the sword of these knights known to slay. With great scaled wings these fiends show no fear, suffering not even gods to pass near. And here we see true that dragons do stumble at the sight of Tiberius, the slaying troop's leader. Tiberius, less than impressed, thrust his cold eyes in my direction with a promise. If you play one more bar, elf, I will snap your neck. You do not wish to be regaled with tales of your achievements? The dragon hunter picked a gold coin off the table and flicked it into the brim of my hat. If it means that much to you, I'll pay you to stop playing. The other slayers' moods improved at the sight of this gesture, but Tiberius was clearly not making a joke. I sat down next to Faust at the corner. The barkeep gave me a strange look until Faust nodded. The old man's with us. I sighed into a glass of wine, picking up on the few hushed, drunken conversations for a while, until Tiberius approached the bar. You seem like the kind that would know a thing or two about dragons. Why don't you come with us on our next mission? You'll have an opportunity to learn more about our clan and about myself as well. Even if in a foul mood, he is seen clutching his image with a masturbatory grin. I could not bring myself to care enough, however. Let him down softly. Considering I know everything about you, and this is the first time we've met, I really have nothing to gain from our partnership. Tiberius scoffed loudly and left reasonably sorer, or so I imagine. When at last we made the climb to our room, searching to discover soft beds and comfortable rest, we instead found dashed hopes. Richard stood face to face with a horse-sized cat-like creature. The beast's body shone metallically in the light of street lamps from outside, threatening to devour any of us with a single snap of its jaw. The creature roared through the air as Richard was turning to spot us. He shrunk under the gravity of the silvery panther. For that split second, the march of the heavens and hells over the earth slowed to a halt. I fixed my gaze at the scene, and Richard's expression gradually shifted uncomfortably into a horrific grimace. My eyes grew wide as terror began to build inside the tiny room. Richard's eyes met with mine, and he seemed unassuming of his own demise. I could only stare while the impossible beast fell upon him in the eternity of a single chilling second. I barely missed the deciding detail before my body finally flinched. The subtle shift of Richard's eyes as the beast's silvery mitts dove into his neck. Amazing. Faust, cover me. I had opened my eyes to behold splinters of a wooden chair leaping away from the cat's attack. Richard bolted for the balcony untouched while I rushed forward to face our foe. With harp tightly knit to my right arm and fingers poised thinly against the strings, I scanned the crest of the moonlight to peer at the creature's eyeless face, revealing its solid, toothy, metallic grimace. The cat threw its body into a confident and deadly bite, bearing down on my shoulders, but Faust launched a thick steel rod into the throatless cavity in time to push the attack off its mark. With a sourly plucked cord that shook the creature's head clear around its shoulders, its curious mass split wide and cracked deep. It really is, I gasped while diving away from the hampered swing of silvery lacerations, made of metal. The creature made no sound, but immediately turned and bolted out to the balcony with its head swaying sickly under the fractured weight. Richard sailed, throwing darts in the direction of the escapee, only to get knocked down from the roof by its bounding form. Faust flung himself out the window after it, and I watched him in the cascading moonlight, launching another rod in its direction and landing on a neighboring balcony to scramble across the rooftops in pursuit. Why is he chasing it? I thought aloud, and called out to the wind. My voice fell over the still air outside, and it churned slowly into an elevating gust, launching me over the rooftops after Faust, while also granting me a brief glimpse of our bearman sprinting up the road. He covered ground remarkably well, but my pocket of air sent me further ahead. After a gentle landing, I kicked off with the momentum of flight into a long dash and called out, "Faust, jump!" My words filled him with purpose, and my wind braced his form as he gracefully leapt up to a high window on a tower. Meanwhile, at the top of this tower, the panther broke into a much higher window. Faust rolled into his window, and the bearman wasted no time climbing the wall to catch up with the scout before I called one final gust, aiming directly for the top. Inside the tower, Faust crouched under the beam of moonlight that drifted in after him. A snore from within the room partly muffled footsteps from outside that faded one after another. After gathering his confidence, Faust snuck out of the room to locate a stairwell leading him into the tower proper. He could hear a rush of air from the top, and beyond that only deadly silence. Peeking his head into the doorway, his eyes darted around the room, spotting my silhouette on the balcony. Rigid and poised harp, his gaze then beheld the gleam of light around the beast's cracked shoulder. The bearman threw his leg around the side of the balcony, swung over the rail, and froze instantly behind me. Faust reared up to deliver his resolve, but I called out to stop him. It was then that he noticed the sleeping face of Countess Vez, cradled comfortably upon satin pillows just inches from the looming metal cat, and lowered his bow. Nothing could be done. The abomination's heavy mitt sank into the White Lady of the North. One swing chased a fantastic shriek from her throat. A second swing made her silent once again. The creature simply sauntered into a disturbance in the air, leaving the three of us alone in the terrible quiet it left behind. Within seconds, men in plate armor burst into the room with lanterns and shouting. I stepped into the room to explain. A creature broke in here. We were trying to stop it. A glaring voice answered me with a stern declaration. By authority of the Knights of Darenthold, you three are under arrest for conspiring against the monarchy. You there. He immediately barked to one of his men. Take them in shackles to the hold. If you really are innocent, then you can help your case by coming along quietly. One of the men approached me and whispered, I'm sorry about this. There I discovered Richard, now wearing the same type of equipment as the guard. I wasn't able to do much this time. I'll try to help. He fastened the shackles to my wrists snugly. The three of us were held overnight in a cell instead of the warm beds at the guest house. I was more concerned with resting than my general well-being, but I did not sleep well, to say the least. During the next morning, we were shoved into a tiny cage on wheels, forced to kneel on wooden panels by steel shackles. Once again, we were face to face with that red-headed slouch of a king. In your failure to complete your mission and sudden crimes against nobility, we're taking you to the judgment grounds, he said far too calmly. His eyes seemed lifelessly cold, but when his gaze met with mine, a sensation rose in my spine that I swear I would feel even in death. He sentenced us to a hearing with chillingly patient words, and then spat before us to punctuate his escape. Our brilliant soul slowly climbed the horizon when we pulled away from our cell. He could only barely be seen over the fine stonework of the walls around the castle city. 30 minutes later, Soul overcame the wall, and we were bathed in his unscrutinizing warmth. The star knew of our plight and would follow us for the next 3 days. I often raised my head skyward with tightly pursed eyelids to gaze upon his brilliance. Citizens of Darenthold began to follow along with him. Stragglers all with nothing better to do than follow their king to a hearing, I thought, and as if affirming my assumption, I found Richard hiding among them. So I heard everything that went on. Richard's gesturing hand held aloft a flag. It was emblazoned with the dragon cameos of Darenthold. His face was almost expressionless. Apparently we're going a very long way. You'll be sentenced by noon on the second day after we get there. Why are you still following us? I asked under my breath. He told me plainly, I have nothing better to do, no money either. Some of the blokes around say the monarch hands out food to anyone making the trip with him. It's some kind of old law, I guess. I closed my eyes and decided to ignore him, and Faust whispered without lifting his head, Are you going to help us escape? Richard remained silent for a few seconds. I can't make any promises. Then leave us. Richard laughed uncomfortably and broke march with us. He would only come back twice more during the pilgrimage. He brought us some bread and water each time and informed us that 2 more monarchs arrived to serve as judges. A host of ambassadors and knights joined in the march. This news arrived close to noon, and the caravan was wading into an empty plain far beyond the castle city. Nothing existed around us beyond the outstretched countryside, but just barely rising over the horizon I spied the tip of a great citadel. Its towering ramparts gradually penetrated the aquamarine sky, and I considered with overwhelming anxiety that it would be the last new place I see. Then the soft, wrinkled face of an elderly woman broke the scene somehow. We locked our eyes on each other, and after sharing a brief silence together, she smiled for me. I felt a mote of hope well up in my bosom. Truly this woman would not wear such a pleasant smile for me if it was certain I would die. I smiled back as a sign of thanks, and she nodded knowingly. Richard let us out of the cage on the 3rd day, and some handlers dragged us away to unchain us. We spent the rest of the day in a more comfortable cage in the citadel. The following afternoon we were finally brought before the court in chains that forced us to stand. Guardians placed us into some glowing rings that seemed to be painted on the floor. Drillid, an older human woman, and an ornately dressed and groomed dwarven man sat in the raised platform before us. They 3 addressed us with placid expressions. After examining us, and with a touch of hatred in his voice, Drillid began the hearing. You 3 have been charged with slaying a monarch of the several kingdoms. You were found at the scene of the bloodied Countess of Fark's Keep, Lady Vez. How do you explain yourselves? The bear man stood silently with closed eyes. Faust shot me a pleading expression, and I pouted honestly as I made an attempt to persuade the court. We did not commit such an act. I orated eloquently with my tongue dressed in magic. There is another witness that can attest to our innocence by the name of Richard. The circle under my feet began glowing brighter. The 3 judges frowned with intense contempt, and Drillid shouted, It is forbidden to use arcana in here. You will cease this behavior at once. He was quite enraged, but I could not help noticing he took his time selecting his words. Meanwhile, the dwarven man took over as head speaker. Through finely braided auburn beard hairs, he inquired, "This Richard, you say, can prove you are innocent? Did he come with the caravan?" "Yes, he's waiting outside." My voice bounced off distant walls that reflected my earnest tone. The bearded one nodded toward Drillid, who sentenced instantly. "Then he will be charged with conspiring to kill the Countess, and the four of you will be executed in one day." The judges stood to exit the citadel. Faust and I scrutinized them loudly, the monarchs of prestigious kingdoms walking stone-faced away from our sentencing like a great and motionless cavalcade. They brought Richard in, and the doors were locked behind him. We explained to him what had just occurred while he made his way across the hall. Only one doorway led out of that colossal building. All the walls were carved from thick marble and held aloft a heavy stone ceiling. Thinking escape impossible, Faust hung his head once again, rationalizing. "We should just give up now. There's no way we can escape alive." I offered a counterpoint. "There's always some chance. You're not even going to try?" "Those bastards run everything," he cried with rage. "They just took our lives away without a second thought, and trying to escape would only give them a better reason." "They didn't have the right," I protested. "No one has that right. They can't take away your life unless you give it up for them. Even if they claim to be their own authority, only you can truly own your life, right?" Faust didn't stir at a single word. But Richard found the inspiration to begin picking apart my shackles. I offered him a sincere thank you, and hurried across the room to free Faust while Richard unchained our unwitting bearded accomplice. Once freed, the old man opened his eyes and uttered a single phrase: "The beating of our hearts." He kicked off the ground with powerful legs and pressured the door with a mighty feet-first leap, which met with two knights unfortunate enough to attempt entering the citadel just then. His aged voice bellowed something difficult to hear as he was enveloped by the rays of sunlight from outside. Faust next to breach the door found the bearman pinned by a swarm of guards. The scout was then netted in the doorway while a leaping Richard got railed by a gauntleted fist. Our plan unfolded flat in mere seconds, and I recalled all the things that I wanted to accomplish in life, unable to act. I withdrew into my mind and watched from behind my wide eyes as two of the guards rushed into the citadel. They advanced upon me wearing purposeful expressions. I was more concerned with what the bear man said before he was wrestled to the ground. I could replay the moment in much greater detail after I had given up on my material concerns. Shock set in, and it made my legs heavy. "Our beating hearts are our authority," he shouted, this with a clear, unwavering voice. Even as his feet came up over his head and his shoulders hit the worked stone below, he was confident in his assertion. Yet I was frozen by doubt, and within minutes the four of us were yanked, knees dragging before the entire crowd that had gathered to witness our fate. A robust man with a black leather mask and a broad axe bent Richard over a wooden stump at Drillid's feet. The red-haired monarch roared loudly enough for the multitudes to hear. "Any last words?" Richard said nothing in favor of struggling weakly against his bindings. The executioner's axe all but missed the center of Richard's thin neck. The top of his head sundered from the base of his brain stem. The wincing face soared down to the lowest step of the killing floor. The citizens were unfazed by the gruesome scene and directed angry shouts at us. Even the kindly old woman who walked alongside our cart during the trip wore a beastly expression as I took my place at the chopping block. Richard's blood had not even been cleaned away. It smelled like rust and coated one of my cheeks. The lady I had shared my last smile with was screaming, "Off with his wicked head!" And then I, Yoni Svet, gave up my life. I was shocked, or perhaps the block of wood was a little more comfortable than I expected. I tilted my head to the side and looked on looking on were the faces of my compatriots. Both were held tight, forced to watch with craned necks. The old man looked withdrawn, with glassy eyes and a calm face, while Faust flinched, and they froze in place with a loud cracking sound. Silence fell upon me, and not a single movement could be seen for the longest moment. At first I thought I'd done something tricky, but then I became confused as I found I could stand. I stared down at my corpse while a pale blonde humanoid approached the scene from somewhere unknown. He stood and calm presented his hand to me. It was then that I knew that I had what I had done to myself. It was some kind of ghost story to tell young children. Those that do nothing to avoid death, whose hearts are unclouded and still do not act, will be invited to sit beside death until the emptying of the hells. With its imagery and told by a skilled speaker, I as a child found it frightening. Many nights of lost sleep might have been preparing me for this moment. But then, I guess I had no other option. I took the man's hand and left to sit beside death. I've been told after my death that our bearman friend was next on the block. As soon as the blade moved, he spun his hip to bring the heel of his foot against it, scattering shards of steel across the killing floor. The axe's blade, now blunted and nearly useless, pressed into the man's flesh and was pushed back by deep muscle control. He stood slowly, held out his arms, and shouted his testimony for all to hear. I, Kent of the Divine Self, present this miracle as proof of our innocence. As it so happened, miracles are an appropriate part of evidence gathering. Kent was able to negotiate for the life of Gunnar Faust, who would be imprisoned for 30 years instead of being killed. Drillid took the two of them back into the great hall and pushed them into a large circular magic sigil painted at the back of the citadel. "We're going back to Darenthold," he growled. "Once we get there, I'm taking this Faust with me to a jailhouse, and you, old man, will head north through the great gate. Never return here." The two had no time to argue. The sigil began to vibrate, and the scene shook, becoming vague and distorted. Once the room stopped vibrating, they found themselves outside the castle Darenthold. Silently, the three of them separated according to Drillid's plan, and Faust was placed into custody as an enemy of the monarchy. It is also said, the very next day, during the 20th new moon of the 5th year, Darenthold would close its gates for the first time since it was built, allowing only those with permission to see the north. History books would blame this on the death of Lady Vez, and historians referred to the event as a tragic moment when free trade and travel was brought to a standstill for the sake of scrutiny. Now, in the great moment of our lives, I am certain there are many prevailing questions with regard to my physical nature. Put simply, at least some of my audience are wondering how a dead bard can tell such tales. For this I do not have an answer. While I admit that is a lie, if I did reveal such worldly secrets, then most of those listening would surely not believe me. In many avenues of reality, especially where faith is concerned, to suddenly know that the origin of the mind and its effects on the universe would put one's psyche under great strain. You see, all thoughts carry weight, and some are heavier than others. Something so seemingly simple as an idea has the power to crush the mind into many small, yet nearly identical parts. Let me not bore you with the pandering of the dead. We can overcome the fragile nature of the mind with some finely crafted words, cleverly selected, so that the strain of their truth does not cause those still living to break down. Is it too late for me? It is too late for me, of course. But what fun would it be for me to tell my tales if it caused my listeners to lose their sanity? Great thinkers in our world have discovered that the problem with reality, if one might find this a problem, is that a person's core beliefs drive their fundamental being. Most agree that even particularly weak beliefs can have a profound effect on perspective, and perspective itself is all we have to call our own, though at times it is not entirely your own. For instance, take the lives of three men who know nothing of each other, and yet had more in common between them than their single chance meeting would suggest. All three men had entered into Darenthold the day after the great gate closed, trying to pass through from one side or the other. No matter the destination, though, no living being that walked the earth that day could find a way through the gate without being held by authorities for a time. So it went that all three men, escorted by the knights of Darenthold, were shuffled into a meeting hall that once served as a gathering place for caravans. In neat rows were laid many folding cots for people to rest upon while waiting for their names to be called. The first passers-by to approach the gate after Kent of the Divine Self had gone through that morning arrived just before sunrise and were handled immediately. New arrivals since then had to wait increasingly longer times. An old travel-worn dwarf had approached the gate from the north. This dusty gentleman, Theos Durbar, was the first to be corralled into the waiting hall. He was told he would be seen as soon as possible, and that there was a grave incident the day before that had to be dealt with. He didn't believe a single word of it, but trusted that the young knight believed it enough for both of them. Still, with dusty braided beard in tow, Theos took a seat upon one of the many cots and took a drink from an auspicious wooden flagon he had been carrying. Nearly an hour later, a large caravan of various pilgrimages were shown into the waiting hall. With them came the other two of our star-crossed stand-ins, both of whom were human, and one of whom had given up their name. The Povertists of Harrow were paladins with steady minds and strong psyches. Their central belief held true that they would receive the highest protection from Harrow if they could give up their name and live without vice or comfort, referred to simply as righteous. They were not permitted to wield objects of magical nature and could not spend more than 1 copper from sunrise to sunset during any given day. A strict doctrine suited to one, and he held himself in high regard for his work. The latter cost for the favors of Harrow is one of the main reasons there were so few whom took the vow. A single copper is not enough to purchase more than a loaf of old bread. Since the founding of the chapels of Harrow, there have only been a few hundred members of the righteous. Many of them were killed off in some bygone war, but those that remain today, descendants of the practice, were usually the most studious or deeply involved in Harrow's papacy. Righteous had arrived with a timid, pacifistic companion wearing blue vestments and a star-shaped sigil stone around his neck. Cedric of Sol. As a priest of the sun, Cedric was bound by the belief that all things that Sol can perceive are worth protecting so long as they do not cause grief to others. To that end, Cedric sought to help the peace in any way he could, so was recounting to Righteous what he had learnt from the knights. They said the wait would only be another half an hour, but they have to see us individually, explained Cedric to the patchwork paladin. The righteous nodded his head and folded his arms as the two of them took a pair of cots across from Thaus, who greeted them both in an instant with a friendly, "Oi, lads! I was beginning to think I'd be sitting here on my own all day. Share a drink with me, boys." Burly and bold, the dwarf produced 2 cups from his backpack and poured what appeared to be a smooth, dark stout from his flagon into each glass until it was clearly full. He handed each holy man one of the cups and then took a long, slow gulp from the flagon himself. Righteous uttered a well-intoned "thank you," while Cedric nodded his head and took a sip. Dwarves ever known for their hospitality, very rare had their gifts refused. Cedric cringed at the bitter taste of the stout. "Thank you. Might I have your name?" Theos tipped his flagon as the gentlemen would tip their hat and offered, "Theos Durbar, at your service, lads, seeing as we're in for the hard wait. What brings you two to the city?" "I'm Cedric of Sol, and this is one of the righteous of Harrow. We came with a caravan hoping to make it into the northern lands. I'm on my way to a small fiefdom a day from here." Righteous gestured plainly. "I have business with the King Drillid. He needs an escort for a dangerous criminal, but I'm seeing my fellow Cedric off before that." Theo's teeth came into view from within his bearded maw. "I happen to be on the way south to visit a foster kid." Cedric smiled nervously and sipped his beer once again while Righteous finished his cup and handed it back to Thaus appreciatively. The friendly old drunk stowed the cup and took another healthy gulp from his flagon before going on about himself some more. "In the north, I walked along the coast from the north gates until I found a great gate and decided to follow it down, follow it through. I usually take a ship, but I've spent my money on this magic flagon." This is fucking. Why did I write that? It's hard to read. I'll get used to it. "You've come quite a distance," Righteous affirmed while pushing a copper coin into Thaus's hand. The dwarf took it respectfully while listening on. "Before I had been to the south, I came from the Herosian capital in the northeast. I was tasked with following a pilgrimage, but that's about done as far as I see it." From behind the unkempt stubble on his face, Righteous smiled while subconsciously patting the grip of a large hammer that lay at his side. Thaus examined the hammer from his cot and scratched his chin. "Say, aren't you righteous fellows supposed to abstain from fancy tools of war?" The dwarf gestured to the silvery hammer as Righteous explained, not daring to miss an opportunity to display his accolades. "This is the hammer of the Pope himself. I received it for agreeing to escort that prisoner I was talking about. Apparently the person's an heretic, but I can't say any more than that." Well, Cedric knew that the hammer itself wasn't magical, though. It served as a powerful focus for Harrow's justice. The young priest felt a strange sadness at seeing Harrow's fist with this particular member of the righteous. Thank you. Thank you for subscribing, Winger. I love you. The young priest felt a strange sadness at seeing Harrow's fist with this particular member of the righteous, but then there was a lot that he felt didn't make sense about the world. He was content to frown for a moment, letting his thoughts pass. Theos was sharp to notice the somber expression on Cedric's face. His fatherly instincts often kicked into gear at the sight of the downtrodden. Perhaps it was just his own belief at work, but Theos always felt the need to comfort a person in low spirits. He invited himself to sit on Cedric's cot and clapped a coarse palm across the boy's back while inquiring, "Why the long face, lad?" Cedric lowered and shook his head, saying, "It's nothing important, really. Come now, lift your chin and tell Papa Durbar what's on your mind, boy. The young priest looked up into the drunk's shining eyes that asked to hear his troubles, and he instead spoke of his duties in the north. When I crossed the great gate, that fief town, one of their citizens is afflicted with a dreadful curse that no one understands. The whole fiefdom is a growing farming community. It's made up of worshippers of Sol, so they sent a request for our order, and I was sent to take care of it. Is that all that's bothering you? The children of Sol are known for their healing magics. You're obviously no initiate. Faust chuckled, half into his flagon, causing some to spill onto his beard. They're telling me it sounds like one of the original sins, Cedric added while finishing his stout. The other two men gave the priest a concerned look. Both knew that the original sins were given the name for the first curses developed by ancient civilizations. While some of them were mild, a few were truly horrid in their machinations. Cedric continued, "There's no way to know what it is until I get there, but I'm confident I can at least ease the kingdom's suffering. Their last harvest was bare, and they believe it is due to this one cursed man." Righteous scowled after reflecting. "The longer we have to wait for the Darenthold Knights, the more dangerous your situation becomes, I say." The Sun Priest shrugged his shoulders. "We of Sol find waiting practical to the cause. Sol's will is done over all of time." For a brief moment the three of them fell silent, ruminating on the ideas that still hung in the air. Here their beliefs became most useful. While Righteous and Cedric concerned themselves with the weight, Thaus's concern shifted to helping his new friends. If not for this small shift, the three of them may never have found room in their minds for change. Thank you for a drink. I take a sip. Yeah. If not for this small shift, the three of them may never have found room in their minds for change. I take a tiny little stretch break. Oh, fuck. Good idea. I happen to be the first in line when the knights start calling out names. You can have me. You can have my spot, Cedric O'Sole. The dwarf smiled comfortably as he let go of his burden of waiting in order to satisfy the burden of helping others. "If you're certain of yourself, I would be most honored to accept such kindness, Papa Durbar." Cedric did his best to show gratitude at being rid of his burden. "You truly have the berumored kindness of your kinsman." Righteous added his own blessing to share in the gratitude. These three men, though from very different backgrounds and of resolutely different motivations, found the time to make peace and released themselves from their troubled states. Only together could they have observed this passage in time to make the most of a dismal situation, and in doing so they laid the first cobblestone in their new paths. Whether this brings them weal or woe rests within their hands, but that is my belief as a lover of stories. When Theos's name was finally called, the three of them sent Cedric on his way with a couple handshakes and luck-laden waves. After meeting with the officers, Cedric hailed a coach to set out for the smallest of the several kingdoms, Harpthorpe. He carried his beliefs on his shoulders, the same place where he wore the golden rays of Sol day after day. He was prepared to deal with one of the original sins if he must, and assured himself he would see it through safely. Cedric briefly recalled, after looking upon the cursed man, the taste of stout still tucked away in the back of his throat. For a long while Theos and Righteous sat alone and shared another drink. Righteous had resolved not to talk about his prisoner escort and would have left if not for being told to wait his turn. It was only just after Cedric's departure that they overheard this hall held people from both the north and south going in either direction. The only way for the knights to be certain of his motives was for the poor paladin to wait his turn with the dwarf of House Durbar, who drank from his flagon to mark every few minutes spent waiting. You have the vast desert to cross in order to see your child, Thaus. What keeps you going in the face of discomfort? Righteous could not longer sit quietly in the throng of visitors and felt it appropriate to speak more on faith. Well, they've got a great pub, he reasoned, and my nephew is always looking for a helping hand. The boy works too hard when he's alone. Righteous closed his eyes, trying to picture his thoughts. There are dwarves living that far south? No, of course not, lad. Some loon abandoned him in the mountains, and I took him in until he was strong enough to make his own decisions. He's a fine lad, very good with his hands, and whatever he does with them. Perhaps you've heard of Marshal Allwether. The ragged man felt a familiar sensation to the name. I've heard of Allwether something or other in Thriss. That's my boy Marshal. To this day, he's the hardest working man I've ever met. I hear he's a sister now, and chants his work with special magic, so I thought I'd check on the boy and see his sister is. He chuckled once again, causing the smooth draught of stout to leap from his flagon, but this time onto the floor. He tilted the cup on its head to drain it into his mouth as an afterthought. I would think, Harrow's paladin began while moving his cloth boot out of the way of the falling beer, that finding one's sister out of orphanhood is a good thing. Ah, burped the drunken dwarf. But his loony parent told us he was an only child, so I can't help but worry over the poor boy. He's always been fond of all the people in society, but humans in particular are oft to take advantage of their own. No offense, Righteous. The devout man nodded and waved his hand. There is no offense in your words. The fact that we call our coalition humanity shows the type of attitude that prevails within most humans. At this, Thaus roared with laughter. That may be, but it's certainly better than calling it dwarf-manity. I find humanity has a decent ring to it. It's my belief that someday humans will find the idea humbling. As time crawled along, the two men were called and said their farewells. Good luck with your prisoner. If they're vile, then show 'em some righteous justice, eh? Indeed, and give my blessings to your nephew, Thaus of House Durbar. Leaving that hall at long last, Thaus walked straight through Darenthold without stopping and continued on his way south. He kept his beliefs to himself, and his opinion he gave away. The dwarf man was certain he would enjoy his trip into the desert. He was prepared to meet with his nephew's new sister, and trusted with all his kindness that she would have a responsible head on her shoulders, or at least a good stomach for honest talk and healthy drinking. Righteous bore his belief openly upon his bestubbled face, always. He was certain he would meet with a dangerous criminal during his next journey, and prepared to corner the monster. The ambitious paladin met to glimpse into the mind of a madman and crush their will to commit to evil. All of these beliefs hold weight in the minds of their owners, but the nature of each person is what determines how easily these beliefs come to be. All three men spawned their beliefs from the innocence within their minds. However, while Thaus walked on with his head held high and positivity in his step, Cedric approached his future warily and carefully, and Righteous pulled himself along, reminded every step of the way that he would be in the presence of evil minds. These three also bore the weight of the other two for a moment. With absolute confidence, I can say these three found to be true what they most believe. One breezy morning, just after the first of Sol's rays had embraced the earth on a secluded hill outside a jailhouse, there stood a giant with a twisted, frosty glaive. This grisly beast looked off into the sky to reflect on its utter blueness, as he would phrase it. His great, hulking form, towering over most of Darenthold's people, and their nervous chattering at his presence, caused him to prefer living in the countryside. Despite his hoofed feet, coarse brown fur, and imposing horns, the giant wore the crest of Darenthold's knights, crudely tied around his armor. Four jagged incisors and a ferocious, beady-eyed glare that persisted even through his most positive of moods, drove the town to call him Minotaur. Most folks would never say he was smart exactly, but his penchant for logic impressed the locals. The easy bit, he often explained, is always knowing where I am. What really taxes my mind is knowing where anyone I've ever met is at. But I know that soon enough if I look. Within his first week of working for the Knights, he had plenty of opportunities to use this impressive logic to get into and out of trouble. He picked up on leads for disturbances, found the people responsible, and served them a nightly course of pummeling if they stepped out of line, although very few did. Thus he earned a name for himself that was even more impressive than Minotaur: the Conflict. Even during his revolutionary age, the conflict was a rarity in society. Even during this revolutionary age, the conflict was a rarity in society. With an awkward mixture of cunning and hard work, he was able to rent his own house in just 8 years, and a few months later, on his 12th birthday, he had anything he needed to be comfortable, but instead became incurably restless. I'll only be around for another 10 years if I'm lucky, and once the rut starts, I won't be able to think of anything but finding me next fuck, he reasoned with himself. While not entirely motivated to leave his post, the conflict was content to guard the lonely holding cell while he mentally explored his lifestyle. But he soon became bored of this and decided to write poetry instead. He became interested in poetry as a younger giant after discovering his first elf, a young harp-playing girl calling herself Rurara. He wrestled with her explanation of poetry for a few minutes and eventually decided he enjoyed having his words written where others could see them. At the time, he only knew the language of giants, which made his first attempt at poetry particularly gruff. Ignite the flame, harness the flame, purpose the flame, burn, burn. The conflict's current poetic endeavor was centered on the clear blue sky above him and existed in stark contrast to the red hat of a wee traveler approaching him. The giant bent over to contemplate the incredibly small creature and snorted his disapproval openly while adding, "Yeah, what do you want, you little bean sprout?" Buckworth Pitterbottom, a dutiful gnome from some place near here or there, winked a charming spell in the conflict's direction and answered, "Don't you even recognize your long-time companion? It's me, Buckworth." The beast lifted the gnome onto his shoulder and straightened his back as well as one could manage with hooves. They exchanged some how are yous, and the conflict asked him what he had been up to until now. Then Buckworth presented an official-looking document that had all the appropriate seals and words necessary for the conflict to abandon his post in an effort to satisfy his rut. You're here to collect the prisoner. What you want with the criminal? Oh, he's only the most important criminal my coin purse has ever heard of. I have to deliver him to a blue fellow just outside town. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just let him out then. In record time, Buckworth had achieved his goal and the door to the cell was unlocked. The gnome went inside and returned with a dazzled, groggy Gunner Faust. The sleep-riddled scout rubbed his eyes and yawned with a half-interested inquiry. Did they decide to execute me after all? Of course not, chuckled Buckworth. You're being purchased. The conflict, would you kindly escort us out of town? Faust barely had time to groan before being lifted onto a vacant shoulder and unable to protest a ride on a minotaur. A 10-minute run saw the three of them arriving by the side of a sparkling lake. As Buckworth promised, a blue-skinned humanoid in loose-fitting clothing was awaiting them. His eyes gleamed with an eerie green hue, and his shoes came to a curled point at the toes. Faust was set down before him, and Buckworth convinced the conflict to go for a swim while the two men spoke. The blue fellow folded his arms and addressed Faust in a proud tone that was the trademark of his species, the Dijin Quasites, known as Ch1. His voice was soft, deep, and penetrating. Gunner Faust, I, Undal, have broken you from your bonds unlawfully. If you do not wish to be sentenced to death for escaping from your cell, then you will do exactly as I say. I'm going to be honest with you, Faust reasoned. I haven't got much to live for as it is. You don't have to threaten me. Promise to feed me, and I think we can work this out peacefully. The Johnny smirked with satisfaction. Very well. I have learned that you used to be a member of the survey team at Fark's Keep. They tell me you outgrew your position and were lured away by some promising adventure. I need you to help me locate a temple to the goddess Elevain. I don't suppose I have a choice. Just give me a longbow and some blank paper, and I'll loot whatever temple your little blue heart desires. Have you turned any other criminals free to back me up? Undal paced in the direction of the lake in time to witness the conflict, leaping out of the water and pitching a terrified Buckworth into the sky. The conflict's body arched into a dive, and seconds later the terrified gnome hit the water with a painfully loud clap. Perhaps that hairy giant will help us. Allowing him to return to his failed duty would only be a waste of a valuable resource, noted Undal, while sending a telepathic message to Buckworth. Once ashore and properly shaken dry, the conflict met with Undal, whom asked, Would you be interested in joining us on our way across the sea? The monstrous giant scratched his recessed chin. Well, I do have to get my fuck on. I'll follow you till I find myself a nice buxom mate. Undal laughed at this, and Faust shook his head, mildly embarrassed. Within a week's travel, and after parting with Buckworth, whom apparently had a garden to keep, the three mismatched strangers arrived in Thriss. Undal set the tone for their timely preparations. I'm going to purchase some traveling gear and secure passage for us on a boat. Faust, I need you to find us a holy man, so we won't need to buy any food or medicine. The cheaper the service, the better, and make sure they're ready to spend at least the next 2 weeks with us. Faust left immediately, and the conflict set his glare on the blue-toned one until he could no longer stand the awkward silence. Undal took in an annoyed breath and pressed for an answer. What is it, conflict? The conflict, son. What? Me name is the conflict. Fine. The conflict. What do you need? I just want to know, what can I do for us? Undal considered the consequences of sending the giant into town to purchase provisions and shook the thought out of his head. Just go looking conspicuous. I don't want you to draw any attention to yourself. Do you understand? All right, I gotcha, was all the conflict said in reply, before tromping off and disappearing between a pair of houses. Faust marched on the local chapel, an enormous building dedicated to the god of justice, Harrow. Once inside, the scout took a survey of the various priests and priestesses, eventually settling on the head parishioner. The man was mostly robes until Faust found his face and nodded. "Good morning, Father. Do you have any miracle workers for hire? I've got a pretty tight budget." The robed man barely gave any notion that he was even paying attention, but answered promptly, "You may have the support of any of Harrow's knights for a donation of 1 platinum sovereign." Faust cringed at the answer and pleaded with the holy man, "Is there any way I can donate a smaller amount?" Looking Faust up and down, the priest understood his predicament and very nearly scoffed. He beckoned Faust to follow him toward the back of the chapel. "There is one knight that comes to mind. If he accepts your case, then you can pay him whatever you want." The two of them meandered over to the very last pew, and Faust was pointed toward a man dressed in rags that were more worn and tattered than his own clothing. "This is one of the last remaining righteous of Harrow." The priest gestured with an open palm before fleeing with a hush in his step. The scout took his place next to the prayerful paladin. Righteous was in a bind, as the prisoner he was meant to escort was not in the holding cell when he arrived, and neither was the beastly guard that was rumored to be its keeper. Facing the possibility of the monarch losing faith in Harrow was not a pleasant scenario for any man who considers himself the pride of the order. This, combined with the added struggle of crossing the desert with very little food and exhausted of his precious miracles for the hope of seeing the prisoner's last known location, had put the impecunious knight in a sour mood. So there was not to wonder about why Righteous was ready with a reason not to help, even before Faust could ask, saying, "I specialize in protecting the poor and unfortunate. That you have come to me on your own 2 legs shows me you are capable of taking care of yourself." Gunnar thought quickly, deciding the most compelling course of action was to tell the truth. "I've been stolen from jail against my will and can no longer live a life of peace. My captor has informed me that he cannot afford to feed me. I cannot escape him before I complete his request, or he will turn me in as a runaway." Righteous lifted his head to look at the man who had such an unfortunate tale to tell. Seeing his sullen eyes so full of doubt and grief, the paladin felt there could be no better answer to his prayers. While he couldn't be sure this man was the same prisoner, he was prepared to spend as much time as possible figuring it out. With a warm smile, he nodded his head, and the two stood up to seek uncertainty together. Meanwhile, Undal had just finished loading the traveling gear onto the ship that would take them south to an island called Urukjakart by its inhabitants, while most folks knew it as the Orklands. The Djinn took flight to get a decent view of Thriss from the air and sent his telepathic message to Faust and the conflict. "It's time to depart. Come to the docks and..." "The conflict, what are you doing?" Directly below, Undal spotted the conflict perched on the side of the chapel, frozen in a pose that seemed somehow more menacing than if he had just been actively attacking people. He floated down to meet eye to eye with the conflict, whom broke his composure to explain himself. "I was being a statue, 'cause you said to look inconspicuous." After gathering themselves and their gear, the 4 acquaintances sailed southward on what would be a 3-day trip. They sat around a large cloth that had been spread on the floor below deck while Righteous prayed. After 10 minutes of chanting, a soft light emanated from the cloth, and plates of simple foods folded into existence, accompanied by some bowls of fresh water. Righteous gestured for Undal and Faust to begin eating, while he again asked Harrow for a meal, this time to satisfy the conflict. This second miracle would not manifest, however, as just a few minutes into the prayer, a call resonated from the upper deck through a series of pipes that facilitated conversation across the ship. "Attention! We're being surrounded by anomalous weather. Prepare to take on water." Righteous looked up from his folded hands and uttered his terrifying realization. sea beasts. This first chapter is extra long to get as much in as possible. On the deck of our friend's ship to the Orklands, a greedy yet fearless privateer captain working for the nobility, and who willingly endangers his crew in order to save even the smallest sum of coins, decides today to save time by sailing his ship directly through what is obviously a magically conjured storm. From a distance, it is clear that this storm is miles wide. Sailing around it would not be a problem, but this privateer gives the word to travel directly through it to save a few hours. As soon as the ship enters the storm, they begin to take on water, and the captain calls for all hands to pull it together. Some of the captain's men are thrown from the ship and lost to the darkness around them. Others struggle helplessly to free the deck from the grasping tendrils of the sea beast below them. All the while the captain shouts his orders while ignoring the plea of his first mate to fire the cannons, while remarking, "Those cannonballs are for ship-to-ship combat. This dull beast is but a trifle." It is then that the first mate reminds the captain that krakens are actually super-intelligent beings bent on evil and greed. While the ship is dead in the water and the storm whips up around them, just as the crew is losing hope and the first mate begins shouting orders over the captain in protest, the conflict charges out from below deck. He demands that the crew trying to cut away the kraken's tentacles move out of the way. Flying across the planks with a single swing of his frosted glaive, he severs 4 of the kraken's tentacles. It releases the ship, and its dark mass can be seen bolting away through the water. Within seconds, the impossibly large creature is gone, and the crew collapses and applauds the conflict, who grabs up some of the severed tentacles and turns to go below deck, where he sees his companions. The conflict tells them it's over, and he doesn't require the righteous to feed him for the rest of the trip. When they finally reach land, the 4 adventurers prepare for a long hike into the desert, while the crew admonishes their former captain. They strip him of his title and decoration, give him a single flintlock with a handful of pellets, and tell him to find his own way back to the several kingdom states. The captain begs our adventurers to take him along. "Please, don't leave me on the beach with just a pea shooter. All I know in this life is sailing and money, please." Righteous confides in him, saying greed is a crutch that will only lead one to ruin. If you can forsake your old ways, not only will you be welcome to travel with us, but you will be much happier in this life. Before them is an island desert. While setting out on foot and with plenty of time to talk to each person in private, the former captain asks our friends what sort of journey they are on. Righteous tells him, "This is a journey of penance and of peace. While the world we know struggles to support its bad habits, we make our heading in order to discover the true face of our lives. I cannot purchase the experience of traversing a foreign land to discover a lost culture and its relics, lives that we could not otherwise begin to comprehend. Once lived here, and learning about them in turn will teach us about ourselves." The captain asks Righteous why he decided to join the march, commenting, "Wouldn't the church be better off having you on the mainland?" "I was hired to support this journey for the sake of these 3. It is Harrow's decision. While the Paladin of Justice walks along your path, you can be sure that it is justice you will find." Faust tells him, "I don't have a place in the society of the several kingdom states. My lineage was soiled by the crooked governments that run the land. Anyone would want to run from such problems as a corrupt monarchy, so when my door was open and I wasted no time escaping an unjust sentence. When this is over, perhaps I'll live with the orc tribes on this island. I don't know. I can't be as bad at living as back there." It can't be as bad as living back there, is what that was supposed to be. Undal tells him, "We're tracking down a forgotten god in order to exhume their temple so we can build a more appropriate structure in its place. If you want to follow us, you'll have to help move whatever we find there so we can raise it to the ground. The captain asks, "Who has given you this task?" Searasi, the one true daughter of the incarnate Dijin Salmaptura. Is she your god or something? She is the rightful heir to the Dijin nobility, and that temple is a direct affront to her divinity. The conflict tells the captain, "I came to get me fuck on." We're heading toward a deserted temple. Then I'll keep traveling until I find some thick lass. Hell, I might not even rest until I have 3 or 4 along for the ride. That's quite an aspiration. What if you don't find the women attractive? The conflict stops and turns to the captain as if trying to figure him out. It ain't about looks, mate. It's about creating my progeny and sending them into the world. That seems pretty pleasant. On the contrary, life is dreadful, son. If beauty had its way, then babes would be carried on the wings of angels, straight to their parents' arms. There ain't no place for that wishful talk, though. We've got genitals to smash together, and if me mate is lucky enough to bear children without horns, then she can yank 'em out like a growth and curse the day she were born a woman. What if they're born with horns? Just think about that for a while.